Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. A week or so ago, a friend of mine who's incarcerated emailed me and told me that I should do a story about immigrants serving in the military and how they're being screwed. So I did a little research and I found today's guest, who is an attorney who specializes in immigration, and she's also a nationally known expert on immigration and national security laws. She's testified regularly before congressional committees and also is a retired lieutenant colonel in the military police, U.S. Army Reserve. Margaret Stock, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate being your guest today.
But I guess, what is the Immigration and Nationality Act, and how is it applicable to immigrants serving in the military?
Okay, well, it's a huge law that was passed decades ago by Congress, and it was an attempt to consolidate a lot of other old laws. And in that law, there are two separate laws that allow immigrants to get their citizenship by serving in the military. But they're really, really old laws. Immigrants have been serving in the military since 1775. And you probably know your stories of American history about Alexander Hamilton. He was an immigrant, served in our military, became a general, of course, a pretty famous guy. And then you might have heard about Valley Forge. George Washington had a ton of German immigrants in the Continental Army at Valley Forge. In fact, at one point, they think about a third of the army was made up of immigrants during the Revolutionary War. And everybody's heard about the Hessians, that supposedly the Continental Army was fighting, but we had our own Germans on our side. And they were immigrants serving in the Continental Army. And there were so many of them that when Baron von Steuben went to the Continental Army at Valley Forge to teach them how to march and so forth, he was giving his orders in German, and he asked for a translator. And somebody said, well, you don't need a translator, General von Steuben, because these immigrants speak German. You can just speak in German and they'll understand you. So immigrants are been in the military for a really long time. And then I think everybody knows about the Civil War. But the Irish were famous in the Civil War for having turned the tide for the Union. There's even a Steve Earle song. It's not politically correct title. It's called Dixieland, but it's all about the Irish coming over from Ireland and joining the Union Army and basically signing up because they were considered terrorists by the British, but they wanted to fight. And they fought for the Union Army at Gettysburg and turned the tide for the 20th Maine. So it's, one of those folk songs that's out there that you might want to listen to that's based on history. There were tons of Irish, of course, on both sides, actually, but the Union had more of them. And then immigrants continued to serve in the 1800s, the Great Wave of Immigration. A lot of immigrants were serving in the military. It was about 18% of the Army in World War I. And interestingly, in World War I, they would get off the boat and get drafted immediately. And many of them were from Germany or Italy, countries that we were fighting during World War I. So what the government would do was turn them into citizens and then send them back to fight against their former country. And you couldn't have them fighting if they were still citizens of Germany against the Kaiser, because that would be treason. So you had to make them American citizens and then send them back. So they had basic training naturalization during World War I. And then they did the same thing during World War II. Actually probably helped us win the war significantly in World War II because we took a lot of German Jewish refugees whom we had accepted as young people into our country as refugees. And we drafted them, turned them into American citizens, put them in military intelligence units, sent them back to the Western Front. And they were responsible for 60% of the actionable intelligence on the Western Front during World War II, because they spoke German fluently. And when we captured people, they could do the interrogations and find out what was going on. And it was very, very effective for us. And then we continued to draft immigrants into the military during the Korean War and the Vietnam War. There's one famous immigrant in the Vietnam War who was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico. And he was drafted into the military, went over to Vietnam, got the Congressional Medal of Honor. They made him a U.S. citizen, and then they put him in charge of the draft. A guy named Al Rascone, Selective Service Director. After he got his citizenship, they put him in charge of the draft again, which was pretty interesting. So immigrants have been an integral part of the United States Armed Forces since day one. They've served in great numbers, and usually they've served in numbers disproportionate to their representation in the population. So usually there's a lot more of them in the military than there are in the general population, but that has completely changed post-Vietnam. In fact, it's the opposite. So today they're probably around 14–15% of the population, but they're less than 4% of the military. And that's due to deliberate policies by the Department of Defense to prevent them from serving.
Okay.
DOD now just doesn't want immigrants serving in the military in large numbers. They're suspicious of them.
Why?
And they're not.
Is there any grounds for this suspicion? I mean, do we have rebellious immigrants serving in the military en
No,
masse?
no. In fact, Rand did a study and found that basically that the native-born Americans are more likely to mess up than the immigrants are. Immigrants are generally, there's always outliers in every crowd, right? But for the most part, the immigrants are much better behaved, less likely to quit, less likely to get in trouble when they're serving in the military. And the government has a big hammer on them, which is the law says that if they don't serve honorably, they can lose their American citizenship. So the law is pretty smart and intelligent. It says if they serve in the military, they get their citizenship, but they can have it taken away if they mess up. So if they, immigrant comes in the military, gets citizenship, and then commits a crime, they can actually have their citizenship taken away. And they know that.
So I think I read that they have to serve 1 year honorably in order to get their citizenship expedited. But even after that, they have to go 5 years.
Yeah, they have to serve 5 years honorably to keep their citizenship.
Yeah.
Minimum of 5 years honorably. Yeah.
What other criteria are there that would allow them to expedite their citizenship as serving in the military? Are those the only two?
Well, it's actually a little more complicated than what you said. So let me try to break it down for you. Law,
Okay.
of course, is always complicated, right?
Yes.
Thelma and Louise, this law is tricky stuff. So there's two laws that allows immigrants to get their citizenship through military service. There's one that lawyers call the peacetime law, and there's another one that lawyers call the wartime law. And these were written by the U.S. government, by the U.S. Congress, and they're written to benefit the United States government. Okay, not everybody thinks, oh, the immigrants are getting their citizenship expedited. That's really cool. No, they're actually written to benefit the government of the United States. So the peacetime law says that you have to serve honorably for 1 year before you can apply for your citizenship. And then as far as whether it's expedited or not, that's really up to the agency. The reason they call it expedited is because most people have to get a green card and wait 5 years to apply for citizenship. So they get to apply earlier because they're serving in the military. The wartime law, which is written totally to benefit the U.S. government, says that they can apply for citizenship immediately after having 1 day of active duty or 1 day in the selected reserve or the ready reserve. Okay, and people go, wow, 1 day, that's crazy. Well, that's actually because the U.S. government doesn't want to send non-Americans over to fight against their foreign country. So if there's a war going on and they want the immigrants to serve in the military, they need to make them citizens for international law reasons. And I'll just give you a case in point that happens today. You're a South Korean male living in America with a green card, and you want to join the United States military. Well, if we don't make you a citizen right away, we can't deploy you to South Korea. Because if you go to South Korea, the South Korean government's going to go, hey, you're South Korean. You're supposed to serve in our military, not theirs. We're going to arrest you and have you detained here in South Korea because you're not serving in our military and you're supposed to be serving in our military. And that actually happens. There's news stories about the government of the United States accidentally sending a green card holder from South Korea back to South Korea, and he's a male, hasn't done his Korean military service. It's mandatory. So the South Korean government grabs him and puts him in jail. And, he's no longer serving in the U.S. military because he's in jail in South Korea. They can also kill people. The Syrian government will execute you if you're caught. A Syrian green card holder is caught fighting in Syria for the U.S. government. So the government needs to have these people be citizens. And in order to kind of make sure there was a hammer to give them early citizenship, they wanted something to make people behave if they got it quickly. They also put in the law that they can take it away from you. But the citizenship is to actually benefit the government, to make sure that, we don't have a problem with our forces being recognized or considered citizens of old countries. And this is actually historical. The British used to grab our Navy sailors and claim that they were still British and try to impress them and put them on Navy ships in the old days. So that's where this comes from. It's basically because the government realizes that people are power, and we need to have as many good people as we can in our armed forces, and we need to make sure they're Americans under international law because that's to our advantage. It makes sure that other governments can't claim them and string them up for treason and, do that sort of the bad stuff to them, put them in jail because they're not serving their old country. So we want them to be fully belonging to us. And we also want the US government to have universal jurisdiction over them, which we would not have if they weren't American citizens. So one of the things you probably never thought about, I'm assuming you're an American citizen. Maybe that's a bad assumption, but
I am.
if you're an American, the US government has universal jurisdiction over you anywhere you are in the world. You can be prosecuted for a crime. If you're not an American, they can't necessarily do that. They also have full tax jurisdiction over you anywhere you go in the world, no matter where you earn your money. The US government, IRS, can come after you. So we always think of citizenship as something that we benefit from, when we do. But the government of the United States also likes to have its people be citizens because it gives the government full control over them in every way, shape, or form.
Now, you mentioned that since the Vietnam War, there's been a decline in the percentage of immigrants that make up the
Right.
armed forces. But since I think 2017, there's been an abundance of policy changes, or maybe not a lot of
Right.
policy changes, but significant policy changes. What are these policy changes? And in your view, are they even constitutional?
Okay. Well, I can tell you they are probably, some of them are constitutional and some of them aren't. But getting back to the basics, we talked about citizenship law. We didn't talk about the law about who gets into the military.
Okay.
Okay. And that's changed over time. So there used to be a pretty simple law that anybody could join the military who was in the United States, regardless of their immigration status. And that law changed after the Vietnam War. So during the Vietnam War, if you were a male running around America, even if you were an undocumented immigrant, you could be drafted, and you could also volunteer for the US Armed Forces. So you could be drafted, and you could also go into your recruiter and say, hey, I'd like to serve this country. It's not my country, but I'm here in America. I want to fight. And the government could sign you up and send you overseas to fight for the United States government. That changed, and most recently changed in 2003. They changed the enlistment law to prohibit people from joining the military unless they have a green card. And I think they did this inadvertently without realizing what they were doing, because it cut off a whole pool of, manpower, we call it, people power, were cut off from joining the military, because now there was a requirement that you had to have a green card in order to join the military. And at the same time that the armed forces imposed the green card requirement, it was getting harder and harder on the immigration law side for people to get a green card. Okay, so very difficult to get a green card, and now this is the entry requirement for joining the armed forces, even in wartime. Okay, so this made it actually a very big problem for Department of Defense, because there was a pool of people that they could no longer call on, people that were in the United States that were fully qualified to join the armed forces, but they didn't have a green card. And I'm not sure how much you know about the immigration system today, but people can wait 20, 30 years to get a green card because they're on these crazy waiting lists, and there's quotas, and the complexity of the process makes it almost impossible for people to get one. There's a famous diagram that was in Reason magazine a few years ago that's like a flow chart of how to get a green card. And the flow chart is full of these stop signs, stop, you don't qualify, stop, you don't qualify. And it's just a giant mess of a flow chart that, makes clear that you're going to need an immigration lawyer, and you're going to be best friends with an immigration lawyer probably for 20 years if you want to get a green card. So this was a big problem for DOD, but DOD never analyzed the problem when they decided to impose, and it was DOD's idea to create a green card requirement. So they had this flow of people coming into the armed forces that were proportional to their representation in the population in prior wars, or overrepresenting their population. And then they decided to just chop that off with no analysis, no cost benefit analysis, no nothing. It was actually one paralegal for the Navy that came up with this brilliant idea of, let's impose a green card requirement. And it passed Congress as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. So suddenly there was a requirement that you had to have a green card come into the military. But they threw an exception into the law when they changed it. And the exception was that the secretary concerned could authorize an exception to the green card requirement if the person was vital to the national interest. So across the board, baseline rule today is you got to have a green card to come in. but they put an exception into the law to allow people in if the secretary said they were vital to the national interest. Nobody was using this exception until John McCain decided to hold a hearing, Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, in 2006, and he asked me to testify at the hearing. He also had a whole bunch of other people testifying at the hearing, including Al Rascone, the gentleman I mentioned earlier that had been the director of Selective Service. So McCain engineered a hearing on immigrants in the military in 2006, and you can go look at the hearing transcript. It's out there on the internet and read it. And he basically asked me, how do we get more immigrants into the military? And I said, we got to use this authority that we have. It's in this law. And that was the start of an effort that became known as military accessions vital to the national interest, which was to try to basically open up the armed forces again to high quality immigrants who were in the United States legally. We didn't want to recruit undocumented immigrants at that point, but to recruit people who are in the US legally. And it was wildly successful. You can see how wildly successful it is by looking at news articles from the time. The Wall Street Journal ran a story, front page story, Korean invasion blindsides the army in a good way. And it was all about how Koreans in America were just piling into army recruiting stations trying to join the military. And because of this recruiting program, we just were flooded with, thousands of qualified Korean applicants. And that was what the story was all about. And you might ask, well, why are all these Koreans wanting to join the military? Well, there's a huge Korean immigrant community in America, but a lot of them can't get green cards. They just don't have a track to getting a green card. So they're on small business owner visas or student visas or professional worker visas. And they have a historically positive view of the United States Armed Forces based on the history of the U.S. Armed Forces being stationed in Korea. There's a program called KATUSA, Korean Augmentees to the United States Army. But Koreans have to do mandatory military service. And so they're used to thinking about serving in the military. And they really like the U.S. military. And they also realized that they were going to get citizenship in the United States from serving in the U.S. military. So then they wouldn't have to serve in the Korean military. So we were just flooded with thousands of applicants who were Korean students, small business owners, the kids of small business owners. The kids in particular were interested in joining because when they turn 21, they have to go back to South Korea. And a lot of them have been living with their parents in America for a really long time. Maybe their parents owned like a, convenience store, gas station, or, some laundry service or something. And so the parents were actually encouraging the kids to join the military. So we were completely flooded with applicants, and it wasn't just Koreans, folks from India. We had a doctor program, and we were completely flooded with applicants who were U.S. licensed doctors that could not get green cards because of the waiting lists, but they were willing to serve in the military as doctors in exchange for American citizenship. So we had over 10,000 people that were highly qualified and came into the U.S. military through the MAVNI program. And then DOD shut it down in 2017.
What is the MAVNI program?
Military accessions vital to the national interest. And it was called that because we were using that law that I mentioned. There's a little exception in the law that John McCain had asked me to testify about called, you can let people in if they don't have a green card if they're vital to the national interest.
Okay.
So we decided that doctors were vital to the national interest, and we decided that people who spoke foreign languages were vital to the national interest. Although we could have picked any group of people that were highly skilled, and said they were vital to the national interest, cyber warriors or, whatever. But we picked those two groups of people, the doctors and the people who spoke foreign languages. And we had no problem. We didn't have to give anybody an enlistment bonus. We didn't have to chase them down. They were just lining up with all their paperwork at the recruiting offices. And the recruiters were calling me Magic Margaret because at the time they were having trouble meeting their recruiting quotas. And as soon as we opened up the program, they didn't have trouble meeting their recruiting quotas because there were so many highly qualified immigrants trying to come into the military. And they were coming in, frankly, because of the citizenship. They were going to bypass the crazy immigration system that doesn't make any sense. And you got to be best friends with a lawyer and pay a lawyer, for years. And so they were willing to trade, missing that experience of dealing with the bureaucracy over at the U.S. Immigration Service for the idea of getting their citizenship fast and also serving for 8 years because everybody had to sign an 8-year contract. So, everybody who joins the United States military has to sign an 8-year enlistment contract. So they were all signing up for 8 years. But they were smart, and they realized that, 8 years in the military is a fair trade for versus 20 years of sitting in a green card quota.
Yeah.
And, and they wanted to live in America, and they wanted to be Americans, and which is the key thing. I mean, we were recruiting people who were in the US legally. And we were also recruiting people who didn't have any criminal record. That was a requirement. They couldn't have any criminal record. They had to score really high on the Armed Forces qualification test. So we had a requirement that they were required to score at least at the 50% mark on the Armed Forces qualification test, whereas Americans can get into the military with a really low score. So Americans who score like a 35 on the test can get into the military, but we wouldn't take Mavneys if they were scoring that low. They had to get at least a 50. And the average Mavney was scoring 89 on the test, and it's scored on a 100 scale of up to 99. So the average was, we were getting an 89. So the Army loved the program because it boosted the Army's quality marks, what they call their quality marks. They were getting like averages of on the tests were much higher, and recruits that do well on the test tend to do better in the military. Because, contrary to historical perspectives, you have to be pretty smart to do well in the military these days. It's a high-tech operation. You got to be able to read and write and use computers and, work as a member of a team and so forth. And if you're not, you can't just throw a rifle at somebody and they're going to be a good soldier. It doesn't work that way anymore. They have to be able to use computers and, basically that sort of thing. So the more educated people are, the better.
Do you happen to know, you mentioned that immigrants in them tend to be better behaved than the Americans serving in the military.
Right.
What about after they get out of the military? I mean, when they have their citizenship and they're living in the United States, what are their crime rates like? Do you happen to know? Are they low, or are they?
Yeah, they're lower. They're much lower than one. Yeah. Well, it's actually not surprising. Let me explain why. Okay. So if you're born in America, there's no screening on you, security screening on you when you're born. You're just born in America and you're an American, right? Nobody does any security screening, and immigrants who enter the United States legally have all kinds of screening done on them, okay, before they get here. And first, they're self-selecting to come here. So the average person living in a foreign country that's not very adventurous is not going to pick up and move to America. Okay, so they're self-selecting to come to America. So they're more adventurous than the average person. They're leaving their home and coming to a foreign country. And then we picked legal immigrants. We weren't recruiting undocumented immigrants who were trying to flee, from conflicts or floods or whatever. We were picking legal immigrants. And these are people who were generally going to go to school in America. So they had to pass the test of English as a foreign language to get admitted to the college in the United States. They'd usually been in America for many years. So they'd been going to a college in America, and they lose their status if they mess up, if they break the law. So walking into a recruiting station, they were already pre-screened by the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State. They'd already gone through background checks. They'd had biometrics. They'd had their criminal records checked. And if they had a criminal record, they lost their status. So that meant they weren't eligible to enlist. They were getting deported. So the group that we were recruiting from was already better behaved than the average American because they had already been pre-screened and selected for their visas and so forth. And they also immigrated to America, so they were generally more the adventurous type that knew how to follow rules and knew how to get a passport and knew how to take tests and comply with paperwork requirements and things like that. And the average American doesn't necessarily know that and doesn't get screened before walking into a recruiting office. The recruiter's the first one that's doing the screening, and the recruiters will tell you they have a hard time, because they have all kinds of people coming in, people with criminal records. People that don't know anything about the military, but they thought, hey, I'm wandering by here. I'll just wander in and look at this, and the recruiters have to chase people down. And today the armed forces are having a major recruiting crisis. They can't find enough qualified Americans of military age who are willing to serve. So the military, 3 services last year missed their recruiting goals, and they're on track again this year. The Navy's going to miss its recruiting goals. The Army and the Air Force are only meeting their goals by, basically making major changes to recruiting. giving people more waivers, that sort of thing. But the other problem is demographics, and this is something I haven't heard our national leaders talking about at all. We now have a rapidly aging population. We do not have replacement rate among the native-born population. The immigrants are the ones having the babies and keeping the birth rate up for America. And there's just not going into the future. If you look at the numbers, there's just not enough young people out there to meet military recruiting standards or requirements that are qualified. And it's a demographic shift in America. A lot of it is actually driven by the anti-immigrant policies of the last few years, which caused legal immigration to drop off substantially. And the legal immigrants, were the ones that were actually having the babies in America that were contributing to our birth rate. And then we now have one presidential candidate, and this is probably another podcast for you, but the 14th Amendment to the Constitution is now in play. This is the amendment that said people who were born in America are American citizens.
Yeah, they're challenging that now, saying that's not what it means. It's absurd.
Right, that's what they're saying. But this has actually been an enormously beneficial amendment for the United States military, because if you're born in America, you're eligible to enlist in the military. And the children of immigrants are one of the big sources of recruits, the ones that are born in America, and as well as immigrants. So they're going to hurt the military substantially if they change that, but that's a whole different issue. But in any event, yeah.
So the whole idea, it seems to me, is that if you offer immigrants expedited citizenship, you create an incentive for them to join the military. You
Right.
boost recruitment. You have a more robust military. But now they're taking those incentives away, and what effect is that having? Because I read that actually now you don't get that benefit. It's actually, you could end up with citizenship more quickly if you weren't in the military than if you were. I don't know if that's true, but is it true? And has this affected, the incentives for the people to join, for the immigrants to join the military?
Well, it has. So first, they've gone back to the requirement that you have to have a green card to join the military. So 2016, they actually stopped the MAVNI program temporarily, and then they killed it permanently in 2017. And then they had a program to naturalize people at basic training that was very robust, that actually started under George Bush when he was president, and then it was killed completely under Donald Trump's presidency, where they wouldn't naturalize people at basic training anymore. So the basic requirements to get citizenship in America are that usually you have to have a green card first, and you have to have the green card for a certain period of time, and then you can apply for citizenship. Right now, today, you either have to have a green card and have the green card for 3 years, or you have to have it for 5 years in order to apply for citizenship. The military's advantage was that you could get it right away. If you join the military, you could get your citizenship right away. So you could cut down on that 3-year or that 5-year waiting period that normally you had to have. If the military doesn't offer expedited citizenship, there's really no advantage to joining the military to become a citizen, because the civilian naturalization process is a lot faster once you file. So today, if you're a civilian and you're applying for citizenship, you go online, you fill out an electronic form, and about 2 months later, in my part of the country, you're a citizen. It's really fast. You go do an interview, you do a test, and you get sworn in pretty quickly. It can be just a few months. If you join the military, it takes a lot longer for them to process your application. So if they don't expedite it, then there's not a really big advantage. And I've actually told a few people that came to see me that, they were all excited about joining the military and getting their citizenship fast. And I looked at their history and I said, you're going to be better off wait until you're a citizen to join the military, because you're eligible right now to apply as a civilian. You're going to get processed a lot faster. And then joining the military as a citizen means you don't have to worry about chasing down your application while you're in the military, and you're going to be barred from a whole bunch of jobs if you're not a citizen. If you join the military today with a green card, you can't be an officer, can't be a ranger, can't be in special forces, can't be a military linguist, can't be serving in any position that requires a security clearance. If you're a citizen and you join, you're eligible for all those positions. So the career fields are much greater for people who are citizens serving in the military because of all the restrictions on the immigrants. And the process right now is a lot slower. Now, I will tell you, they've started to try to restore basic training naturalization, but it was really slow. DOD finally signed a memo of understanding with DHS just last summer to start up basic training naturalization again. The Air Force is doing it pretty well. The Navy's doing it pretty well. The Army, not so well. They just haven't put the resources and the energy into making it happen. So I ran into a soldier in Anchorage, Alaska at the immigration office about 2 weeks ago who was trying to get his citizenship. And I said to him, did anybody help you file when you joined the military? And he said, no. I asked about it. He said, the recruiter told me I'd get my citizenship when I joined the Army. Recruiter promised me that. But when I got to training, nobody would help me. They wouldn't let me file the application. Finally, when I was finishing my training, they finally gave me the paperwork I needed to try to file, but they told me they couldn't help me with it. I was on my own. So I had to wait until I got to my first duty station in Alaska and then file my application. So he went online and filed it himself, and he was getting processed and everything, but he was delayed by about a year. So if he had applied as a civilian, he probably would have had it faster.
Now, in addition to the policy changes, they've also, if I'm understanding it correctly, been discharging immigrants from the military before they would meet the eligibility requirements. Is that true? And why are they doing that? Is it I mean, cynically, it seems obvious why they're doing it, but I'd like to not be so cynical. But is it just to screw them out of the citizenship that they've been promised? Is that what's happening?
No, I wish I could tell you that they were doing it for that reason, because that would make some sense. And you're the rational egoist, right? But the reasons are actually more bureaucratic. Okay.
Oh, surprise, surprise, right?
Surprise, surprise. Okay. So what happened was, and this is, I'm going to try to give you the short version of this, but it involves bureaucracy gone bad, basically, which would not be a surprise to you. So somebody at DOD in leadership said, gosh, we got all these immigrants in the military and they're really dangerous, because we know immigrants are really dangerous. So we have to do background checks on them. And our current background checks, which were very robust, are not good enough. Okay, now they didn't have any evidence that they weren't good enough. This was just somebody's fever dream that they're not doing enough background checking, right? But if you're in the military, background checks sound good, right? You should do background checks on everybody, right? So what they did was they decided to have special background checks just for immigrants. And they came up with a list of things that they wanted to know about that were basically from the 1950s when McCarthyism was going on. They wanted to know if the immigrants had foreign parents. They wanted to know if the immigrants had foreign bank accounts. They wanted to know if the immigrants had foreign property. They wanted to know if the immigrants had relatives who served in a foreign military. So they came up with all these questions, which were all based on foreign, 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 foreign. Now, the weird thing about it was these were immigrants. So the answer to the question, do you have foreign parents, was yes, because you're an immigrant, right? Of course you have foreign parents. Do you have foreign property? Well, they immigrated from a foreign country, so they probably got foreign property. Did you ever have a foreign passport? Yes, well, they were immigrants, so they had a foreign passport. These questions were all actually designed for like Americans that they were afraid might be communists in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody dug them out of the archives at the Pentagon and said, let's use these for the new background checks on the immigrants. And then they went and hired some contractors, and it cost millions of dollars. And they gave the contractors the questions, and they said, you need to go ask these immigrants who've enlisted in the military all these questions. And we have to find out if there's any derogatory information on these immigrants. And if there's derogatory information, we're going to kick them out. So the contractors got their list of questions, and they put the immigrant in a room for like 8 hours, and they'd interrogate them harshly about all these questions, these McCarthy era type questions. Do you have foreign parents? Yes, I have foreign parents. Well, what are their names and what do they do? And, they'd write all this stuff down and do a big report. And then having foreign parents was considered derogatory. And then they would kick you out of the military because you had foreign parents. Okay. And I kid you not, this is what was going on for a while. Now, thankfully, this has stopped today because somebody realized this was like dumb. But the government spent millions of dollars to figure out that immigrants who had joined the military had foreign parents. Okay, I mean, literally like millions of dollars. And you talk about, $1,200, toilet cleaning brushes and toilet lids and stuff. I mean, this was the same kind of thing. Nobody rationally sat there and said, does it make sense to pay a contractor millions of dollars to figure out that immigrants have foreign parents? It made no sense at all. And they didn't find, in the end, they didn't really find anything derogatory. You know, the people would answer these questions and everything, and they'd write up these giant reports, and it would be labeled derogatory. You know, you have foreign parents because you answered yes to the question. But then the immigrant would appeal, you know, we're going to kick you out of the military. Some people would just get kicked out. They say, I don't want to fight with you guys. I don't care. You know, you're doing this evil thing to me. You know, I'm just getting out. But other people would say, no, I'm a good soldier. And it's silly that you're kicking me out for having foreign parents. So they filed lawsuits, you know, saying that this was not fair and everything. And so finally lawyers got involved and people looked at it and said, yeah, this is not too bright, you know, to be kicking out these people for having foreign parents. I'll just mention one case because it was hilarious. There was a Korean guy serving in the military, and his father had been a he did environmental documentaries for the Korean equivalent of National Public Radio. And they were kicking him out because his father did environmental documentaries for Korean public radio. Because they said he had a father who worked for the Korean government, you know, because he was basically in the equivalent of National Public Radio over in Korea. And the same guy got told he wasn't eligible to serve in the US military because he had relatives who served in the Korean military. Okay, so mandatory military service in Korea, all the men have to serve in the Korean military. He had male relatives. He's getting kicked out of the US military, even though his Korean relatives were serving in the South Korean army, which is our ally, you know. And we have this KATUSA program, Korean augmentees to the United States Army, you know, that's like Koreans actually serve with us in Korea, you know, while they're serving in the Korean army and the KATUSA programs. And they were booting him out of the US military for this. You know, it made no sense. But I had stacks of these reports. I was just reading them all day long, and they were funny and to me, but they weren't funny to the immigrants getting kicked out of the military. You know, you have foreign parents, this derogatory, or you used a foreign passport to travel, that's derogatory. Well, wait a minute, he's a foreigner. He has to use a foreign passport to travel. He can't get an American one yet because he's not an American. You know, and this kind of stuff was going on. They have stopped that today, and they're not doing that anymore because what was happening was the immigrants were all getting kicked out of the military. And so they'd sign them up, they'd spend all this time recruiting them, and then they're just picking them out, you know, for having foreign parents. It didn't make any sense, and somebody finally figured that out. So that's over. They're not doing that anymore.
You know, I often think if they, I don't know, maybe not often, but I've thought about it. If you want to cure somebody of being a conspiracy theorist or a believer in this all-powerful, nefarious deep state, just have them go talk to some of these bureaucrats for a little while, and it'll disabuse them of the possibility that these people are constructing these massive plans. I mean, they have people there actually who think it's they've a gotcha question or a good question to ask an immigrant if they have foreign parents. For God's sake, I mean, it's so ridiculous. A child could figure this out, but yet these masterminds can't seem to. It absolutely blows my mind. But I digress. Back to the immigration issue. As an expert in immigration and in a retired military colonel, what would the ideal be for you if they gave you the power to design a plan to fix this situation with immigrants in the military to maximize the benefit to the US military, what would you do?
Well, I just go back to what we did historically, which worked really well. You know, and what we did historically was we allowed anyone who was qualified to join the military come into the military if they met background checks, recruiting standards, could pass the test. I wouldn't require them to have a green card to come in because I know the legal immigration system is broken right now, and the green card process is just, you know, it's a mess. So I'd let them come into the military as long as they were legally in the United States, as long as they'd been here at least a few years so they knew what they were getting into. And as long as they met military standards so they could pass the test, they spoke English, they were educated, you know, they didn't have a criminal record, the usual military recruiting standards that we've applied with success across the board for decades. So I'd make them meet those requirements, and then I'd give them citizenship right away because it benefits our country to make them citizens. And I'll also tell you that they're really enthusiastic citizens. You know, they're converts
Makes
to
sense,
the,
yeah.
you know, yeah. And I mean, these are people that want to live in America. and they want to be part of our republic. They want to be Americans. It's not like they're running away from it. And there's no draft, so you don't have to be in the military to be here. We'd get people that are motivated and that want to be in the military. And it is easy to background check immigrants, the legal immigrants. It's a lot easier than background checking a native-born American who has nothing in the computer and no record and no State Department clearance and no Department of Homeland Security record. DHS collects huge amounts of information on people who are immigrants. So it's easy to background check people. And we found that out. I mean, when we did the program originally, we were doing robust background checks on people, and we just got so much information on people. It was easy to screen out anybody who was a bad guy.
Okay, Margaret, before I let you go, is there anything we've missed that you think is important for people to understand about this issue?
I don't think we've missed it, but I want to emphasize that we do have a demographic situation happening in America where it's not the good old days where we had unlimited numbers of young people who are healthy and able to join the military. In fact, every so often I hear somebody talking about the draft. They can't bring back the draft because it would be a failure. 80% of the people couldn't get drafted. I hadn't mentioned this earlier, but the crisis is so bad right now that less than 20% of the Americans of military age are even qualified for the military today. And that's bad, and it's a function of a lot of social factors going on. People have, with gross obesity is a big problem in America, so people can't meet the physical standards. Mental health issues running rampant, drug use, people haven't graduated from high school, can't pass the test. But less than 20% of Americans of military age right now are actually qualified for the military.
Wow.
Yeah. And there's lots of reports out there about it. You can go look at, Heritage Foundation. There's a whole bunch of retired Army generals that wrote a report. I think it's called Too Fat to Fight. And they want to get soda pop out of the schools, the vending machines, because they basically think that's one of the big contributors. There's been a decrease in physical fitness standards. It used to be in the old days that gym class was a big deal at school, and people spent a lot of time working out and people were more physically fit, and now everybody's in front of the TV, working on their thumbs. So that's a problem. That's a big problem now with physical fitness. So there have been a lot of demographic changes in America, and we're also seeing the same problem a lot of Western countries are, where our native-born population is not replacing itself anymore. Their birth rate's way down. So that means fewer recruits for the military. And the immigrants do need to serve in proportion to their representation in the population for us to have a robust armed services. When the percentage is, 14% of the population is immigrants and they're less than 4% of the military, that's just math. Again, you're the rational egoist, right? There's your recruiting problem.
Not the rational mathematician.
But
I do
seriously,
understand some basic
that's your
math.
recruiting. That's your recruiting problem. If you're only recruiting 4% and they're 14% of the population, that's that 10% is the problem.
Yeah.
That's why you can't get enough people, because you're not recruiting them. So anyway, it's pretty simple, and I don't, I think we covered it pretty well, but I think people just need to look at the big picture and realize that this is a matter of national security. I was in New York on September 11th, 2001. I was teaching up at West Point. And after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, it came to light that the US government actually did have information ahead of time that would have prevented the attacks if we had read it and analyzed it ahead of time. So we had information in our computers that was in foreign languages that we had collected, but nobody had translated it. And if we'd had enough people that spoke the language of the attackers, we probably would have figured out what they were up to and been able to stop the plot before it happened. And that was the impetus for my interest in getting the MAVNI program going. Was I thought it was crazy that the United States government didn't have enough people who spoke foreign languages working for the intelligence services. And I wanted to get those people in so they could protect us. And it's the same thing today. We need immigrants in the military because we have a lot of adversaries out there who are in foreign countries, and we need to be able to understand what they're up to and read their emails and, figure out what's going on with them. And there are a lot of patriotic immigrants that don't like the country they came from, and that's why they're here. And they'd like to be part of this country. It's been a long tradition of people leaving old countries that they didn't like and joining ours because they believe in our principles of freedom and democracy, and they want to become part of us. And the way they prove that is they join the military and they do things that help us with our national security, like reading intercepts in Chinese, and telling us what they say. So I think it would be a benefit to our country, a great benefit to our country, to bring more immigrants in.
I agree with
Okay.
you 100%. Margaret,
Yeah.
thank you so much for the work you do, and thank you so much for joining us today. And where can people find you? I almost forgot the
Oh,
important question.
okay. So it's really easy to find me, but I'm an attorney at Cascadia Cross Border Law Group in Anchorage, Alaska. We do have a website, and I'm also apparently all over the internet on Wikipedia, and it's pretty easy. People find me all the time. So, but Cascadia Cross Border Law Group in Anchorage, Alaska.
Excellent. Okay, for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.